Maggie's place hummed with lunchtime chatter. Sophie stood at the counter waiting to order when two men approached. One pressed against her shoulder, fake smiling. The second blocked her escape path, smirking. Sophie tried pulling away but was grabbed firmly by the wrist. Ethan, dining with his young daughter nearby, immediately stood. Within 15 seconds, one attacker lay face down in an arm lock. The second howled as his wrist bent unnaturally against the floor. The restaurant froze in shocked silence. Someone whispered, "Who is that guy?" Ethan Cole carried himself with quiet confidence that came from seeing more of the world than most in Riverdale would ever know. At 35, his broad shoulders and steady gaze spoke of strength, while the gentle way he tucked a napkin into his daughter's collar revealed his tender heart. His dark brown hair remained cropped short, military style, despite having been out of service for years. The light stubble along his jawline softened his otherwise stern features. Once Lieutenant Cole of Navy SEAL Team 6, for the past 3 years he'd simply been Mia's dad. A title he wore with more pride than any military rank. The small office job at the local insurance company paid the bills, though it hardly challenged a man who had once led special operations in territories whose names most Americans couldn't pronounce. His coworkers knew little of his past. He preferred it that way. Every morning at 7, he packed Mia's lunch, braided her hair with surprising dexterity, and walked her to the elementary school 4 blocks from their modest 2-bedroom home. Every evening, he sat patiently as she recounted her day's adventures, hanging on her every word as though they were critical mission briefings. Ethan had promised his late wife Claire that he would give their daughter a normal life. After Claire's sudden death from an undetected heart condition, he had left the military, unable to reconcile the demands of service with the needs of a grieving 3-year-old. Sometimes, in the quiet moments after Mia fell asleep, he would sit on the porch and wonder if he'd made the right choice. But then morning would come, and Mia's smile would erase all doubt. Mia was her father's world, a bright-eyed 6-year-old with her mother's honey blonde hair and her father's determined chin. She carried colored pencils everywhere, ready to capture any scene that caught her imagination. Her favorite subjects were superheroes, though her version wore normal clothes and looked suspiciously like her father. She ordered chocolate chip pancakes every Saturday at Maggie's place, always saving the last bite for her stuffed rabbit, Mr. Whiskers, who accompanied them on these weekly outings. Sophie Moore had moved to Riverdale just 6 weeks ago, seeking a slower pace after years in Chicago's graphic design industry had left her burned out. At 29, she had built an impressive freelance client list that allowed her to work from anywhere. Her apartment above the local bookstore was half the size of her city loft, but twice as peaceful. Sophie's warm brown eyes complemented her natural curls, which she often gathered in a messy bun while working. A leather portfolio was her constant companion, filled with sketches and ideas that might become her next design project. She had come to Riverdale to escape. Not just the city's pace, but the remnants of a relationship that had ended painfully. David had been charming, successful, and, as she discovered too late, manipulative. The emotional scars were still healing, leaving her wary of new connections but determined not to let fear dictate her life. This small town, where strangers smiled and remembered your coffee order after just one visit, felt like the fresh start she needed. The town of Riverdale embodied small-town America, its main street lined with family-owned businesses and the obligatory town square hosting farmers markets each weekend. Maggie's place sat at the corner of Elm and Main, its brick exterior weathered by decades of seasons. Inside, vintage photographs of the town's history adorned walls the color of warm honey. The restaurant had been passed down through 3 generations of the Roberts family, currently owned by Margaret Maggie Roberts, who knew the perfect balance of friendliness and respect for privacy that kept locals coming back daily. Few places felt as authentically American as Maggie's place at lunch hour. A cross-section of the community, gathering over comfort food and bottomless coffee. It was here, in this seemingly ordinary setting, that extraordinary lives would intersect in ways that would change them forever. The restaurant's normality shattered when Ethan stepped in to protect Sophie. As the police led the 2 subdued men away in handcuffs, the lunch crowd's excited whispers created an electric undercurrent. Officer Jenkins, who had coached Little League with Ethan last summer, gave him a knowing nod before taking statements from witnesses. The officer had always suspected there was more to the quiet father than he let on. "You didn't have to do that," Sophie said, her voice still unsteady as she approached Ethan's table. Her hands trembled slightly, adrenaline still coursing through her system. "It's nothing," Ethan replied, his focus primarily on Mia, who stared wide-eyed at the commotion. He placed a reassuring hand on his daughter's shoulder. "Those men won't bother you again." Mia tugged at her father's sleeve. "Daddy, is the pretty lady okay?" Ethan's expression softened at his daughter's concern. "Yes, sweetheart. She's fine now." Sophie crouched down to Mia's eye level, summoning a smile despite her rattled nerves. "I'm Sophie. Thank you for letting your dad help me." Mia nodded solemnly. "My daddy helps everybody. He's the strongest." The innocence in the child's declaration brought a genuine smile to Sophie's face. "I believe that now." Across the restaurant, two elderly women who had witnessed everything leaned toward each other. "Did you see how fast he moved?" One whispered. "Military training." "For sure." "Special forces, I'd bet my pension on it." "Harold mentioned he never talks about his past at the office," her companion replied. "Always figured there was something about him." Sophie overheard their speculation, her gaze returning to Ethan with renewed curiosity. There was something in his efficiency of movement, in the controlled power she'd witnessed, that spoke of specialized training. Yet there was also a gentleness in how he now wiped chocolate milk from his daughter's upper lip. "I really am grateful," Sophie said, straightening up. "If there's any way I can thank you." "Just being safe is thanks enough," Ethan interrupted, already gathering Mia's crayons and placing them in a small tin container. His tone was polite but final, closing the conversation. Sophie nodded, taking the hint. "Well, thank you anyway." As she turned to leave, Maggie herself approached, refilling Ethan's coffee without asking. "On the house today," she said with a wink. "For our local hero." Ethan shook his head. "I'm no hero, Maggie. Just did what anyone would do. But not everyone could do it like that," Maggie countered, before moving on to other customers. Mia looked up at her father with pride shining in her eyes. "See, Daddy? I told her you're the strongest." Ethan smiled, but Sophie noticed something in his eyes. A shadow, perhaps, or a hint of sadness that didn't match his daughter's admiration. He gathered their things, left money on the table despite Maggie's offer, and guided Mia toward the door with a protective hand on her back. Sophie watched them leave, struck by the contradiction of strength and vulnerability he seemed to embody. Later that night, as Sophie sketched in her apartment, her mind kept returning to those 15 seconds of controlled chaos, wondering about the man who had so effortlessly inserted himself between her and danger. The weekend farmers' market transformed the town square into a vibrant tapestry of local produce, handcrafted goods, and community spirit. Sophie wandered between stalls, her canvas tote gradually filling with fresh vegetables and a loaf of sourdough from the local bakery. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of apple cider and cinnamon, mingling with the earthy aroma of fresh harvest. She was examining a display of local honey when a familiar voice caught her attention. Turning, she spotted Mia's blonde head bobbing through the crowd, the little girl enthusiastically pointing at a stand selling homemade fudge. Behind her, Ethan navigated the market with the same quiet alertness Sophie had noticed in the restaurant. His eyes constantly scanning their surroundings even as he smiled at his daughter's excitement. Sophie hesitated, unsure if she should approach. Their last interaction had ended abruptly, and something told her Ethan valued his privacy. But before she could decide, Mia spotted her and waved energetically. "Daddy, look. It's the lady from the restaurant." Mia tugged at her father's hand, already pulling him in Sophie's direction. Ethan's expression registered recognition, followed by a brief flash of what might have been resignation, before settling into a polite smile. "Hello again," he said as they approached. "Hi," Sophie replied, then knelt to Mia's level. "Hello to you too, Mia. Are you enjoying the market?" The little girl nodded enthusiastically. "Daddy says I can get fudge if I eat all my vegetables at dinner. I'm going to get chocolate, and maybe peanut butter too, but not the kind with nuts because Jimmy at school is allergic, and even though he won't eat my fudge, it's better to be careful." Sophie couldn't help but smile at the earnest explanation. That's very thoughtful of you. Rising to her full height, Sophie turned to Ethan. I wanted to thank you again, properly, for what you did. I was pretty shaken up that day. Ethan shifted uncomfortably, adjusting the weight of the reusable grocery bags in his hand. Anyone would have stepped in. Not like that, Sophie said quietly. Most people would have yelled or made a scene. You were efficient. Something in Ethan's posture changed at her observation. A slight stiffening of his shoulders, a guardedness entering his eyes. Just lucky timing. He deflected. Sophie recognized the wall going up but pressed gently. Well, thank you anyway. I'm Sophie Moore, by the way. I don't think we properly introduced ourselves. Ethan Cole, he replied with a short nod. And you've met Mia. The little girl beamed at being acknowledged, then tugged at Sophie's hand. Do you like pancakes? We go to Maggie's every Saturday morning for pancakes. Daddy lets me get chocolate chips in mine. Ethan's expression softened as he watched his daughter's natural openness. Mia loves making new friends. He explained to Sophie. Pancakes are my favorite, Sophie told Mia with a smile. Especially with blueberries. You should come with us sometime, Mia declared. Looking up at her father expectantly, Ethan hesitated, caught between his instinctive caution and his daughter's hopeful expression. If Miss Moore is ever free on a Saturday morning, maybe she could join us, he conceded. Sophie understood the careful olive branch he was extending. I'd like that. And please, call me Sophie. The following Saturday morning found Sophie entering Maggie's place earlier than her usual routine. She told herself she was simply hungry, that she had work to complete and needed proper fuel. But as her eyes immediately scanned for a certain father-daughter pair, she acknowledged the pretense for what it was. They were there, in a corner booth. Mia with colored pencils spread across the table. Ethan sipping coffee while reading something on his phone. It was Mia who spotted her first, waving with such enthusiasm that several colored pencils rolled onto the floor. Sophie, you came. The little girl's delight was contagious. We saved you a seat. Didn't we, Daddy? Ethan looked up, surprise and something less definable crossing his features. We did, he confirmed, standing politely as Sophie approached. Though we weren't sure you'd come. I heard there were legendary pancakes, Sophie replied with a smile, sliding into the booth opposite them. How could I resist? Maggie appeared almost immediately, coffee pot in hand. Well, look who's joining the Saturday morning crew, she observed with thinly veiled interest, filling a mug for Sophie. The chocolate chip pancakes are Mia's favorite, but the blueberry ones aren't bad either. Blueberry sounds perfect, Sophie said. As Maggie retreated, Mia pushed a blank paper towards Sophie. I'm drawing our street. You can help if you want. I'd be honored, Sophie replied, selecting a green pencil from Mia's collection. Ethan watched their interaction with quiet intensity. You're good with her, he observed as Mia became absorbed in perfecting the shape of a tree. Sophie glanced up. She makes it easy. She's a special kid. She is, he agreed, his expression softening. Sometimes I wonder how I got so lucky. I think she's the lucky one, Sophie said gently. Not every dad would change their entire life to be there for their child. Something in Ethan's expression closed at her observation. You hear things around town. It wasn't a question, but Sophie answered anyway. Small towns. People talk. But mostly I observe. The way you are with her, it's clear she comes first. This became their unofficial routine over the following weeks. Sophie would join them for Saturday breakfast, sometimes bringing her sketchbook to draw alongside Mia. Occasionally, they would run into each other at the park or the grocery store, brief encounters that gradually lengthened into genuine conversation. Sophie learned that Ethan had an unexpected dry wit that emerged when he was comfortable. Ethan discovered that Sophie could identify any dog breed at a glance and harbored an encyclopedic knowledge of obscure animated films. Mia adopted Sophie as an honorary art teacher, proudly showing her each new drawing technique she mastered. One rainy afternoon, they encountered each other at the town library. Mia was selecting picture books while Ethan browsed the history section. Sophie, caught in the downpour without an umbrella, had ducked inside to wait out the storm. Daddy says rain is just the sky cleaning itself, Mia informed Sophie solemnly, clutching a stack of books about dragons. Your dad is pretty smart, Sophie replied, helping Mia balance her ambitious selection. He knows everything, Mia continued. He can speak French and Arabic, and he knows how to fix anything that breaks, and he can tell which way is north without a compass. Sophie raised an eyebrow as Ethan approached. Arabic? Huh? That's not a common skill in small-town America. Ethan's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. I traveled a lot. Before Mommy went to heaven, Mia added matter-of-factly, her attention already shifting to a new book on the shelf. Sophie caught the flash of pain in Ethan's eyes before he masked it. I'm sorry, she said quietly. I didn't mean to pry. You didn't, he assured her, his voice equally low. Mia talks about Claire easily. I'm grateful for that. Kids her age. They process differently. And what about you? Sophie asked gently. How do you process it? The question clearly caught him off guard. For a moment, the carefully constructed walls lowered, and Sophie glimpsed the raw grief still living behind his composed exterior. One day at a time, he finally answered. Some days are harder than others. That evening, Ethan sat on the edge of Mia's bed, finishing their nightly story ritual with The Velveteen Rabbit. As he closed the book, Mia looked up at him with serious eyes. Daddy, is Sophie your friend? The question caught him by surprise. I suppose she is, yes. Good, Mia declared, snuggling deeper under her colorful quilt. Because I think she's lonely sometimes. Like how you get lonely when you think I'm sleeping. Ethan froze, stunned by his daughter's perceptiveness. What makes you say that, sweetheart? Sometimes I wake up and hear you walking around at night. And sometimes you look at Mommy's picture for a long time. Mia's voice held no judgment, only the straightforward observation of childhood. Sophie looks like that too sometimes. Like she's remembering something sad. Ethan smoothed his daughter's hair, buying time as he processed her insight. Everyone gets sad sometimes, Mia. Even grown-ups. I know, she replied with surprising wisdom. But it's not as sad when you have friends. Word traveled quickly in Riverdale, and Sophie soon heard the whispers about Ethan's military past. Mrs. Abernathy at the post office mentioned offhandedly that Cole boy was some kind of special forces before his wife passed. The barista at the coffee shop spoke with awe about how he never talks about it. But my cousin works at the VA in Carson City and says he's got medals you wouldn't believe. Sophie found herself increasingly curious about the man behind the carefully constructed normalcy. There were moments when she caught glimpses, the way he always positioned himself with a view of all exits in any room, how he could shift from relaxed to hyper-alert at unexpected loud noises, his habit of scanning crowded spaces with practiced efficiency. One evening, after Mia had persuaded them both to visit the town's small ice cream parlor, Sophie finally gathered her courage to ask directly. They sat on a bench in the town square, Mia happily occupied with her rainbow sherbet a few feet away on the fountain's edge. So, Sophie began casually, were you really a Navy SEAL? Ethan's spoon paused halfway to his mouth. His expression remained neutral, but she noticed the slight tension in his shoulders. Who told you that? Everyone. No one. It's a small town. Sophie shrugged. You don't have to talk about it. If you don't want to. Ethan was quiet for so long that Sophie thought he might not answer at all. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. Yes. For almost 11 years. That's a long time, Sophie observed, careful to keep her tone conversational. It was my life, he said simply. Until it couldn't be anymore. Sophie followed his gaze to Mia, who was carefully examining each colored layer of her sherbet before taking precisely ordered bites. Because of your wife? Ethan nodded. Claire died, suddenly. Heart condition no one knew about. I was deployed when it happened. The pain in those simple sentences was palpable. By the time I got home, Mia had been with neighbors for 2 days, asking when Mommy was coming back from the hospital. Sophie felt her throat tighten with empathy. I'm so sorry, Ethan. I left the service the next month, he continued. As if needing to complete the story, now that he'd begun, my commanding officer tried to persuade me to stay, offered stateside assignments, but He shook his head. Mia needed stability. Needed me present. Not deployed for months with no guarantee I'd come back. That must have been a difficult decision, Sophie said softly. Ethan watched Mia, a complex emotion crossing his features. Easiest decision I ever made, actually. Hardest one to execute. He turned to look directly at Sophie. 11 years of training. Of brotherhood. Of purpose. You don't just walk away from that without losing parts of yourself. The rawness of his admission struck Sophie deeply. This was the most he'd ever revealed about himself, and she recognized the trust implicit in his words. Thank you for telling me. He seemed almost surprised by her simple response. Most people have more questions. I'm not most people, Sophie replied with a small smile. And besides, some stories deserve to be told at their owner's pace, not the listener's. Something shifted in Ethan's expression. A softening, a recognition. No, you're definitely not most people, Sophie Moore. That night, Ethan sat with Mia during their bedtime routine, the little girl unusually thoughtful as she arranged her stuffed animals in their designated sleeping positions. Daddy, can I ask you something about when you were a soldier? The question caught him off guard. Mia rarely asked about his military service, perhaps sensing his reluctance to discuss that part of his life. Of course, sweetheart. Were you scared sometimes? Ethan considered her question carefully. He had always been honest with his daughter, adjusting for her age, but never lying. Yes, I was scared sometimes. Everyone gets scared. Mia nodded, absorbing this information. Even the brave people? Especially the brave people, Ethan told her, smoothing her hair. Being brave doesn't mean you're never afraid. It means you do what's right even when you are afraid. Like when you helped Sophie at the restaurant. Ethan smiled slightly. That wasn't scary for me, honey. But yes, something like that. I told Sophie you were in the Navy, Mia confessed suddenly. When you went to get napkins at breakfast, she asked if you were always so careful about everything, and I said yes because you learned it being a SEAL. Was that a secret? Ethan felt a momentary flash of concern, but it faded quickly. No, sweetheart, it's not a secret. It's just something I don't talk about much anymore. Because it makes you sad? Sometimes his daughter's perceptiveness took his breath away. Sometimes it does. I miss the friends I made there. Like you miss Mommy? A different kind of missing, Ethan explained gently. But yes, it's hard to lose people you care about. Mia was quiet for a moment, her small face serious in the soft glow of her nightlight. I think Sophie would understand. She looked sad sometimes, too. The weekend brought unseasonably warm weather, drawing townspeople outdoors to enjoy what might be the last pleasant day before winter. Sophie was enjoying lunch at an outdoor cafe when she spotted a familiar face. Not Ethan or Mia, but Jason, her former colleague from Chicago. His unexpected appearance sent a jolt of surprise through her. Sophie Moore, Jason called, approaching her table with a broad smile. I thought that was you. What are the odds? Jason, she managed, rising to accept his enthusiastic hug. What are you doing in Riverdale? Client meeting in Carson City. Thought I'd take the scenic route back, he explained, pulling up a chair without waiting for an invitation. The office hasn't been the same without you. Their conversation flowed easily, reminiscing about shared projects and mutual colleagues. Jason had always been a good friend, one of the few who had recognized David's controlling behavior before Sophie herself had seen it clearly. His familiar presence was comforting, a bridge between her new life and the career she'd built before. Neither noticed Ethan passing by with Mia, returning from the hardware store. Ethan paused momentarily, observing Sophie's animated conversation with the unknown man, the casual way the stranger's arm draped across the back of her chair, the easy intimacy of their laughter. Something uncomfortable twisted in his chest. Something he hadn't felt in years. Daddy? Isn't that Sophie? Mia asked, tugging at his hand. Yes, but she's busy, Ethan replied, gently guiding his daughter forward. We shouldn't interrupt, but we always say hi to friends, Mia protested, looking back over her shoulder. Sometimes friends need private time, Ethan explained, quickening their pace slightly. We'll see her another time. When Sophie joined them for their usual Saturday breakfast the following week, Ethan was noticeably reserved. His responses were polite but brief, his usual dry humor absent. Mia carried the conversation, oblivious to the subtle tension between the adults. As they were leaving, Sophie touched Ethan's arm lightly. "Is everything okay?" "Fine," he replied, his tone neutral. "Just tired." "Work's been busy." Sophie studied his face, clearly not believing him but choosing not to press. "Okay. Well, I'm here, if you want to talk." "Actually," Ethan said, the words coming before he'd fully considered them, "I saw you the other day. With your friend. At the cafe." Understanding dawned in Sophie's eyes. "Jason? He's a former colleague. He was passing through town." "You seemed close," Ethan observed, immediately regretting the comment. It wasn't his place to question her relationships. Sophie's expression shifted from confusion to something harder. "We are close. He was one of the few people who stood by me when my ex became controlling." Her tone carried a defensive edge. "Not that it's really any of your business, Ethan." The sharpness of her response caught him off guard. "You're right. I apologize." "No, Sophie began, then stopped, clearly frustrated. "This is exactly what I didn't want when I moved here. People making assumptions, jumping to conclusions without asking." "I didn't mean to." "Didn't you?" Sophie challenged. "Because it felt like you were judging me based on one glimpse of a conversation you knew nothing about." Ethan felt the familiar walls rising, the instinct to retreat from emotional confrontation. "You're right. I overstepped." "That's not." Sophie took a deep breath. "I'm not looking for you to just agree and shut down, Ethan. I thought we were becoming friends. Friends talk to each other." "Daddy, why are you and Sophie fighting?" Mia's worried voice interrupted their tense exchange. Ethan immediately crouched to his daughter's level. "We're not fighting, sweetheart. Sometimes grown-ups have disagreements. But it's okay." Sophie knelt beside them, her expression softening for Mia's benefit. "Your dad and I are fine, Mia. Sometimes friends have misunderstandings." Mia looked between them skeptically. "You both look mad." "Not mad," Sophie assured her. "Just working through a grown-up thing. It doesn't change how much I like spending time with you and your dad." Ethan glanced at Sophie, struck by her instinctive kindness toward Mia, even in the midst of their disagreement. Sophie's right. Everything's fine. But as they parted ways outside Maggie's place, the unresolved tension lingered between them. Ethan walked home with Mia, uncomfortably aware that he had allowed old insecurities to create a rift in one of the few meaningful connections he'd formed since Claire's death. The misunderstanding might have festered longer if not for the unexpected return of danger to their small town. 3 days later, Sophie was leaving the post office at dusk when she noticed a familiar face across the street. One of the men from the restaurant incident, watching her with unmistakable malice. Her heart rate accelerated as she quickened her pace toward the more populated Main Street. The man followed, now joined by 2 others she didn't recognize. Sophie ducked into the hardware store, nodding hello to Mr. Patterson behind the counter, while surreptitiously checking the window. All 3 men waited outside, one leaning against a parked car, the others smoking with deliberate casualness. With shaking hands, Sophie pulled out her phone and, after a moment's hesitation, called Ethan. He answered on the second ring. "Sophie, I'm at Patterson's Hardware," she said, keeping her voice low. "The guy from the restaurant is outside with friends. They followed me from the post office." Ethan's response was immediate. "Stay inside. I'm 3 minutes away. Has Patterson seen them?" "No, I don't think so." "Tell him. Stay visible to him and other customers." Ethan's voice was calm but carried absolute authority. "I'm on my way." Sophie approached the counter, explaining the situation to Mr. Patterson, who immediately positioned himself near the front window, shotgun within reach beneath the counter. A reminder that small-town America had its own protection systems. True to his word, Ethan appeared within minutes, approaching from the side street rather than passing directly by the waiting men. He entered the hardware store casually, acknowledging Patterson with a nod before joining Sophie near the paint samples. 3 of them, he confirmed quietly. The one on the left was at the restaurant. The others are new. They know where I live, Sophie said, the realization sending a chill through her. They must have followed me before. Something dangerous flashed in Ethan's eyes. They won't get near you. What do? We call Jenkins, Ethan replied, already dialing. And then I'm walking you home. Officer Jenkins arrived promptly, questioning the men who claimed they were simply waiting for a friend. With no direct threats made, there was little he could do beyond warning them about loitering. The men departed with obvious reluctance, the original attacker casting a final glare toward the store where Sophie and Ethan watched from the window. I don't like it, Jenkins told them. But legally, my hands are tied until they actually do something. They're planning something, Ethan said with the certainty of someone who had assessed countless threats. The original guy, Reynolds, he's carrying a grudge from the restaurant, but it's more than that now. It's about pride, Jenkins nodded grimly. I'll increase patrols near Sophie's place and the bookstore. Best I can do for now. As dusk deepened into true night, Ethan insisted on escorting Sophie home, his posture alert, eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. I called Mrs. Abernathy to stay with Mia, he explained. She'll be safe. They walked in tense silence until Sophie finally spoke. I'm sorry about the other day. I overreacted. Ethan shook his head. You didn't. I was out of line. No, you, Sophie sighed. Look, we both handled it badly. I should have explained about Jason instead of getting defensive. Ethan was quiet for several steps before responding. It wasn't my place to question. Who you spend time with is your business. But you care, Sophie said softly. That's why you asked. The simple observation cut through Ethan's carefully maintained defenses. Yes, he admitted. I care. The following afternoon brought heavy rain. Sophie worked at her drawing table, occasionally glancing out at the deserted street below. The confrontation the previous evening had left her unsettled. But the weather provided a sense of security. Surely, no one would be lurking in this downpour. Her phone rang, displaying Ethan's number. Hello? Sophie, his voice was tight with controlled urgency. Are you home? Yes, working on a project. What's wrong? Reynolds was just released on bail for another charge. Jenkins called to warn me, but he's stuck with an accident on the highway. Ethan's words came rapidly. I'm picking up Mia from her friend's house. Can you meet us at Maggie's in 20 minutes? I don't want you alone right now. You think he'd actually try something? Sophie asked, already gathering her essentials. I think he's unstable and fixated. 20 minutes, Sophie. Please, I'll be there, she promised, ending the call. Sophie hurried through her preparations, pulling on a raincoat and grabbing her keys. As she locked her apartment door, a noise from the bookstore below caught her attention. A faint crash, as if something had been knocked over. The store was closed on Sundays, its owner away visiting family in the next county. Sophie hesitated on the landing, listening intently. Another sound confirmed her fears. Footsteps moving through the shop below. Heart pounding, she silently retreated up the stairs, re-entering her apartment and locking the door behind her. With shaking hands, she called Ethan back. I think they're in the bookstore, she whispered when he answered. I heard someone downstairs. Ethan's response was immediate. Bathroom. Lock the door. I'm 5 minutes out. Jenkins is on his way. Sophie moved quickly to the bathroom, securing the lock and stepping into the tub to minimize noise. Through the thin walls of the old building, she could hear movement below, then the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the stairs leading to her apartment. A testing of her door handle. A low laugh. We know you're in there, sweetheart. Reynolds' voice called. Just want to have a conversation about your boyfriend. Sophie remained silent. Phone clutched to her ear. Ethan's steady breathing her only connection to safety. She heard a shoulder ram against her door. Once. Twice. The old wood creaked ominously. 3 minutes, Ethan whispered in her ear. Stay quiet. The third impact splintered the doorframe. Sophie heard them enter her apartment, carelessly knocking things over as they searched. Check the bedroom, Reynolds directed. She's here somewhere. A heavy fist pounded on the bathroom door. "Found her," another voice called. "Come on out, lady. We just want to talk." The bathroom door shuddered under repeated blows. Sophie pressed herself against the far wall, frantically searching for anything she could use as a weapon. The shower curtain rod, flimsy aluminum, was her only option. The door frame cracked. One more solid hit would break through. Sophie yanked down the curtain rod, holding it like a staff. Her back pressed against the tile wall. The next impact never came. Instead, she heard a sudden commotion in her living room. A crash, a shout of pain. The distinctive sound of a body hitting the floor hard. More sounds of struggle. Then an eerie silence. "Sophie?" Ethan's voice, tense, but controlled, called from outside the bathroom. "It's safe. Open the door." With trembling hands, she unlocked the bathroom door. The scene in her apartment left her momentarily speechless. Reynolds lay unconscious near her overturned coffee table. Another man was slumped against the wall, blood trickling from his nose. The third attacker was nowhere to be seen. Ethan stood in the center of the destruction, phone to his ear, reporting their location to Jenkins. His knuckles were raw, a cut above his eye dripping blood. But his posture remained combat-ready. Upon seeing Sophie, something in his expression shifted. Relief, breaking through the adrenaline. "Are you hurt?" he asked, crossing to her in 2 quick strides. Sophie shook her head, still clutching the shower curtain rod. "You got here so fast." "Mia's with Mrs. Abernathy," he explained, gently taking the makeshift weapon from her hands. The third guy ran. "Jenkins is 2 minutes out. With backup." The reality of the situation hit Sophie all at once. These men had broken into her home. Would have hurt her if Ethan hadn't arrived. Her legs suddenly felt unsteady. Ethan guided her to sit on the edge of her bed, away from the destruction in the living room. "I've got you," he said quietly. "You're safe now." Sophie looked up at him, noticing the blood on his face. "You're hurt." "It's nothing," he dismissed, his attention focused on her. "They won't touch you again. I promise you that." The absolute certainty in his voice anchored her, steadying her racing heart. In that moment of clarity, Sophie realized something fundamental had shifted between them. The walls Ethan had maintained so carefully had come down completely in the face of her danger. "I was so scared," she admitted, her voice barely audible. Ethan crouched before her, taking her cold hands in his warm ones. "You did everything right. You called for help. You found a weapon. You protected yourself until backup arrived. That's all anyone can do." The apartment soon filled with police officers. Jenkins took statements while paramedics checked Sophie for injuries and bandaged the cut above Ethan's eye. Reynolds and his accomplice were handcuffed and removed from the premises, this time facing serious charges of breaking and entering, attempted assault, and violating bail conditions. "You can't stay here tonight," Jenkins told Sophie as the scene was processed. "The door's completely busted. She'll stay with us," Ethan said before Sophie could respond. He looked to her for confirmation. "If that's all right with you?" Sophie nodded, suddenly exhausted as the adrenaline drained from her system. Mrs. Abernathy had put Mia to bed by the time they arrived at Ethan's modest home. The older woman took one look at their faces and quietly gathered her things. "There's soup warming on the stove," she told Ethan. "That poor girl looks like she needs it." After Mrs. Abernathy departed, Ethan showed Sophie to the guest room, a simple space with a twin bed and a small desk. The bathroom's across the hall. There are clean towels in the cabinet. "Thank you," Sophie said, standing awkwardly in the doorway. "For everything today. I don't know what would have happened if—" "Don't," Ethan interrupted gently. "You don't need to think about that." Sophie nodded, swallowing against the tightness in her throat. "How did you learn to be so calm in situations like that?" A shadow crossed Ethan's face. "Years of training. When you're responsible for other lives, you can't afford to panic." "Is that what it was like?" "In the Navy?" Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Sometimes. Different scenarios, same principles. Assess, decide, act. He hesitated, then added, "The hardest part was always after. The adrenaline crash. The second guessing." "Is that happening now?" Sophie asked perceptively. "No," Ethan replied, with surprising certainty. "Not this time. Some threats are clear-cut. Some actions don't require second guessing." The simple declaration warmed something in Sophie's chest. "I'm glad you were there." "So am I," he said softly. That night, Sophie slept in the unfamiliar bed, surrounded by the subtle security of Ethan's home. Sometime near dawn, she was awakened by a small voice. "Sophie, are you awake?" Mia stood in the doorway, clutching Mr. Whiskers, her blonde hair tousled from sleep. "I am now," Sophie replied gently, sitting up. "Is everything okay?" Mia approached the bed hesitantly. "Daddy said bad men tried to hurt you." "They tried," Sophie confirmed, keeping her voice calm for the child's benefit. "But they didn't succeed. Your dad helped me." Mia nodded, apparently satisfied with this explanation. "He's good at helping people. That's what he did in the Navy." "I believe that," Sophie said with a smile. "Can I show you something?" Mia asked. "Of course." Mia disappeared briefly, returning with a piece of paper. "I made this last night. Mrs. Abernathy helped me spell the words. It was a drawing of 3 figures holding hands, a tall man, a woman with curly hair, and a small girl between them. Above the figures, in careful child's handwriting, were the words, "Our family." Sophie felt her throat tighten with emotion. "It's beautiful, Mia. Daddy says family isn't just who you're born with. It's the people who stay when things get scary." Mia looked up at Sophie earnestly. "You stayed." Before Sophie could respond to this profound observation, Ethan appeared in the doorway, concern evident in his expression. "Mia, I told you to let Sophie rest." "It's okay," Sophie assured him, carefully setting the drawing aside. "We were just having a little art appreciation moment." Ethan's expression softened as he recognized the drawing. "Breakfast is ready, if you're hungry." The kitchen was warm and filled with morning light. Ethan moved with practiced efficiency, flipping pancakes while Mia set the table. The domestic scene was so normal, so peaceful, it was difficult to reconcile with the violence of the previous day. As they ate, Mia chattered about her school project on butterflies, seemingly unaffected by the drama that had unfolded while she slept. Sophie marveled at the resilience of childhood, at Ethan's success in creating this haven of normalcy for his daughter despite the dangers he had faced. "Jenkins called," Ethan said quietly when Mia left to brush her teeth. "Reynolds and his friend are being held without bail this time. The third guy turned himself in this morning." "So it's over?" Sophie asked. "It's over," Ethan confirmed. "Your landlord is fixing your door today. Should be ready by this afternoon." Sophie nodded, staring into her coffee cup. The thought of returning to her apartment brought unexpected anxiety. "Thank you for letting me stay here." "You're welcome here any time," Ethan said, then added more hesitantly. "In fact, I was thinking, maybe you'd like to join us for dinner tonight. After everything gets settled." The invitation held more significance than its simple words suggested. This wasn't their usual casual encounter, but a deliberate choice to bring her into their home, their routine. "I'd like that," Sophie replied with a smile. "Very much." That evening, as Ethan prepared spaghetti in his kitchen, Mia insisted that Sophie help make the garlic bread. The 3 of them moved around the small space with surprising harmony, as if they had been sharing meals for years rather than hours. After dinner, Mia proudly presented her latest art project from school, a family tree with photographs and drawings. She pointed to the empty spaces on one branch. "Miss Wilson said we can add important people even if they're not related by blood." "That's where you'll go, Sophie." Ethan looked momentarily alarmed by his daughter's forwardness, but Sophie simply smiled. "I'd be honored to be included in your family tree, Mia." Later, after Mia was tucked into bed, Ethan and Sophie sat on his back porch, watching fireflies blink in the evening darkness. The night was peaceful, the events of the previous day already beginning to feel distant. "She's amazing," Sophie said softly. "So resilient, so open-hearted, despite everything she's been through." "Kids adapt," Ethan replied. "Sometimes better than adults." "And what about you?" Sophie asked, turning to face him. How have you adapted? Ethan was quiet for a long moment. For a long time, I didn't. I just existed. Focused on Mia. On giving her stability. It was enough. And now, his gaze met hers. Steady and honest. Now I'm starting to remember. There can be more. That loving Mia doesn't mean closing myself off from everything else. Sophie reached out, her fingers lightly touching his. I came here to hide, to heal. I didn't expect to find this. This? Ethan prompted, his hand turning to hold hers properly. Connection, Sophie clarified. A place where I fit. People who see me clearly. I see you, Ethan said quietly. I've been seeing you since that first day at Maggie's. One Saturday morning several weeks later, the three of them sat in their usual booth at Maggie's place. Mia colored contentedly while Ethan and Sophie shared sections of the local newspaper. The restaurant buzzed with the familiar weekend crowd, conversations and silverware creating the comfortable backdrop of small-town life. A new customer entered, pausing to survey the busy dining room. He leaned toward Maggie at the counter. Who's that man over there? He asked, nodding toward Ethan. Maggie followed his gaze, a smile warming her weathered face as she observed the tableau, Ethan saying something that made Sophie laugh. Mia looking up from her drawing to join their amusement, the three of them illuminated by sunlight streaming through the window. That's just a father, Maggie replied. But he's the kind who can protect his whole world. The morning light bathed their table in golden warmth as Ethan reached across to take Sophie's hand, Mia's smaller one joining theirs in the center of the table. In that moment of perfect connection, their pasts no longer defined them. They had become, simply and profoundly, a family.